Joining us on the pod, she is the host of the Rachel Maddow Show on MSNBC and co-author of the new book Bagman: The Wild Crimes, Audacious Cover-Up, and Spectacular Downfall of a Brazen Crook in the White House. A new book out December 8th. Please welcome back Rachel Maddow.
Hi, Jon. How are you?
I'm okay. It's so good to see you. I want to start by I want to talk about the book. I want to talk about what it means for this moment. But I just want to start by asking you how you're doing because, you spoke on your show in a way that was so much more personal than we'd ever heard you speak before about COVID and how it had impacted your family. How are you? How is Susan?
Thank you for asking. That's very sweet of you. I'm fine. COVID-wise, I've been negative the whole time, even though Susan got it. We were really lucky with testing, basically. She knows exactly how she was exposed. The person who exposed her knew had symptoms the next day and got tested the day after that. And Susan immediately got tested within the hour. And that allowed us to find out she was positive and separate. And so I got really lucky by virtue of the fact that we had testing and effectively good contact tracing. But she got really sick. And it was super terrifying in a way that I will never forget. That has changed me permanently. And she's better now. She's going to be fine. But definitely having some of those the long-term sort of a long tail of symptoms that a lot of people I think that most people have when they get considerably sick from it. But bottom line is we're fine. And we went through a terrible scare. And if anybody is not taking it seriously, just follow my instructions and take it seriously and don't deal. Such a terrifying thing to see somebody that you love that sick and sick in a way that you couldn't predict what was going to happen,
Well, I'm glad she's out of the woods. And, I hope, when you see people like Jim Jordan and others owning the libs by saying that people shouldn't, avoid contact and should do whatever they want for Thanksgiving and Christmas, when I saw your sort of wrenching statement, and when I see statements from doctors talking about sitting on the ground in the middle of the ER and breaking down because they feel so overwhelmed, it's a reminder that who you're really owning are people. You're owning people. You're owning doctors. You're owning families. But I wanted to talk to you about the book. So first of all, I loved the Bagman podcast. It was one of my favorite podcasts, one of the great docuseries podcasts. I loved it. And I learned a lot about it. And, and I was shocked by just how corrupt Spiro Agnew was and just how many parallels there are to this moment. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they gave an interview to Jake Tapper over the weekend in which they said the right things to me on what the Justice Department should do, which is basically the Justice Department's independent. The next administration should follow the law. The next administration should follow the facts. They won't be influenced by politics. That was a welcome relief because there'd been some murmurings about how we need to move forward and we can't look backwards. And I wanted to ask you, what are some of the lessons as you were working on Bagman, thinking about this corrupt vice president who was involved in open bribery schemes, in terms of this moment, about this tension between wanting to hold politicians accountable, wanting to have a system where politicians obey the law while there being political realities and wanting to focus on healthcare and the economy and what have you. How have you been thinking about that?
It's funny because I think part of the reason that Bagman was so well received as a podcast is in part the timing, because it was definitely not about Trump. And it was definitely not about something that connected directly to today's politics. And so I think it was more of an unadulterated pleasure because it didn't feel all that news adjacent when we first put the podcast out a year and a half or whatever it was ago. But where the Bagman story ends up right now for the book ends up being super news adjacent because he is the first president or vice president who not just committed crimes, but provably committed crimes, and prosecutors had to contend with whether or not to charge him and how to deal with it. And that's exactly where we are right now with individual one, with President Trump. And it turns out that his sort of denouement in office is as Shakespearean and weird as any of us could have imagined. But there looms this question of what to do about his involvement in felonies, particularly felonies for which other people have done prison time, right? Michael Cohen did prison time for a felony that not just Michael Cohen, but prosecutors say the president directed him to commit. And that whole hush money scheme, just that alone, was a felony campaign finance violation for which other people had to do time. And the question of him getting off from it is weird. And Agnew's the closest contention we have with that in history. And the resolution of Agnew was all about trading justice for safety, right? You traded away the prospect of him going to jail for, like, they had 40 felonies lined up to put in an indictment against him. They traded away that possibility to get him to quit so that he couldn't end up being president when Nixon ultimately fell out through Watergate. There's nothing like that now. And Trump will leave office under the circumstances that we're living through right now. And so that does put us sort of once again in fresh territory in terms of justice. And I don't like the idea of politicians and past presidents being prosecuted. I don't like the idea of what the Republicans will do with that precedent when they decide that, you know, whatever they're going to call a crime from some Democratic president is worth following that same precedent. But the idea that he just gets to walk away paying no price at all, with the Justice Department and prosecutors just never contending with what he did, it just doesn't, the balance isn't there. The balance isn't right.
Yeah, well, it's hard to talk about a counterfactual, right? Like Spiro Agnew launches basically a kind of a fake news campaign against his charges, which he ultimately gives up on so that he could kind of make this deal where he trades basically pleading no contest to something, doesn't do jail time. They drop the prosecution. He resigns. Nixon gets a full pardon. The country moves forward. And yet here we are all these years later. And, you can draw a straight line from what happens back then to the kind of the gauzy, blurry way we talk about how the law applies to a president. Do you wonder what would have happened if somebody like Agnew had the commitment to the lie of somebody like Donald Trump, right? Like, isn't Donald Trump really taking what that corrupt person did and taking it to its logical extreme, never giving an inch, never surrendering, and having a much even bigger platform to use at his disposal to promulgate the lies? Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's a totally good insight into where those paths diverge, because there's like this amazing moment with Agnew. You have to remember that Agnew and Nixon didn't like each other. Nixon is like increasingly on the hook for Watergate, is really trying to survive. Agnew's on the hook for a completely unrelated scandal that has nothing to do with Watergate, but these two things are coincident in terms of time. And there's this amazing moment where Agnew goes to the Speaker of the House, goes to the Democratic Speaker of the House at that point, Carl Alpert, who was like 4'11" and like this incredible little bowling ball force of nature. He goes to Carl Alpert and like basically begs him to impeach him. Says like, I want you to bring a congressional investigation of me. And I want you to start impeachment proceedings against me. And Carl Alpert is like, this is weird. Nobody's ever asked to be impeached before. And the funny scene where he then shows Agnew's sort of offer to the House Judiciary Chairman Peter Rodino, who responds to Agnew's lawyer, tell him to go F himself. Because no, we're not doing you the favor of impeaching you. You are going to get indicted and you're going to go to prison, and we're not going to do this other thing in order to get you out of it. That was Agnew trying to play his odds in the House and the Senate. He was like, it's a Democratic controlled House. They'll probably impeach me with the Republican. They'll never get enough Republicans in the Senate to remove me. That's fine. Maybe that will talk everybody out of this indictment idea. And they didn't do it. But that's in part because the Justice Department was so stalwart. Elliot Richardson was so ramrod straight and had so much integrity and was so not getting bullied out of this that everybody believed that a prosecution was possible. And the thing with Trump is that he's willing to call everybody's bluff. He's willing to double and triple down whatever he's in trouble for. He's always willing to do more of it. And he will follow the line till the very end, in part because he convinces himself of it. But the difference now is that everybody in positions of power, every Republican could potentially hold him to account, especially Bill Barr's Justice Department, right? They can't be trusted to do the right thing. And so the more he pushes, the bigger the envelope gets. And that's the difference. The difference is not bad men holding power. Like, that's a constant, right? Agnew and Trump, bad men holding power, doing bad things with it. The difference is whether or not law enforcement can be counted on, and whether or not there are people of principle in positions where they're going to hold them accountable. And that, like Bill Barr versus Elliot Richardson, is the divergence. Trump and Agnew are basically the same animal.
So I want to talk about how Trump has been using this sort of right-wing propaganda machine, sort of the nascent version that appears in Bagman. We talk a lot about democratic strategy. We talk about fundraising. We talk about messaging. We talk about whether defund the police is an inappropriate slogan. We talk about what Democrats could say. It seems like a lot of times we're looking for our keys where the lights are shining, because there's this big, huge, there's this festering crisis of misinformation on the right. It is what has led to COVID denialism. It is what has led to Trump remaining popular when someone like Nixon became less popular. How are you thinking about that right now as you approach your job, as you approach this incredible lack of trust in journalism that's part of a strategy on the right?
I've been thinking a lot about this, in part because I feel like there's a little bit of a feeling, at least in my part of the news business, that's like, okay, like this election was a huge test in terms of dealing with real information versus misinformation, and whether or not stunts like the Hunter Biden laptop and all that other stuff was going to get laundered through the mainstream media the way all of that disinformation stuff did in 2016. I think the media did a better job refusing to go along with those reindeer games this time. Not a perfect job, but a better job of it. But what happens now? I mean, there's one technological thing that's happening along the same time that we're seeing this huge disinformation push on the right. And that is that we really do have people cutting the cord, people not having access, people not watching television, people not accessing traditional print media in the same way that they do, and people being more online, purely online in terms of their information gathering. Well, there's no purely online, daily, live news in the way that there is watching TV. And I'm not saying the TV news is perfect, but podcasts are one thing. There's some streaming news, but nobody watches it. There are not many people watch it. There's a lot of interesting like documentaries and people doing weekly series and stuff like that. That's working. But in terms of like flipping on the news at 6:30 or flipping on the news at 9 p.m. and seeing what's going on there, people are getting away from that way of consuming news. And the resulting media landscape is less live news and less remunerative live news and more fractured in terms of the right-wing stuff getting really kooky. And so I don't know what that's going to do in the long run. I don't think people have less appetite for information, but there's going to be less traditionally curated and edited live daily news sources that are consumed by people under the age of 50 for the foreseeable future. And I think that probably just means that our brains get more sort of Facebook addled in the future than they are even now. I mean, how do you think about that? You guys have built a really big platform that's news-based and information-based, but it's different.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've said this to you in the past that, I think one of the great mistakes is saying that Facebook has made us polarized or that our media ecosystem is polarized. And what I actually, my signal example of that is the world would be a better place if Sean Hannity were the Rachel Maddow of the right. Because he would have integrity and he'd respect his audience. And yeah, he'd come at it with a point of view, but he'd be sharing information, not trying to trick people, which is fundamentally what he's doing. That is different. And so I guess part of it is, I think, what I've been thinking about is how do we change the language that we use around this? Because actually, we're no more, when a group of people get on a rocket ship and go to Mars, we don't say the Earth is getting farther away from the astronauts. We don't talk about it that way. We have a big, vast, flawed, but rigorous news environment, and actually progressive news is part of that environment, and it reaches independents, it reaches liberals, it reaches nonpartisan people to some extent. And then you have this sort of bubble, this ecosystem on the right. And once people fall into it, it hits sticky. They get stuck inside of it. And Nixon, Agnew, it's a good example because one of the reasons we're not talking about, as you say, President Agnew is because they lost Republicans. George W. Bush lost Republicans, right? Like when they were failing, when reality set in, when they were corrupt, when they had participated in catastrophes of one form or another, they lost enough of their party to lose political power. That isn't happening anymore.
Yeah.
And so to me, I don't know what the answer is, but I do think it starts by having an honest conversation about what's going on. We're not polarized. Something else is happening.
Yeah, there's a divergence from reality, and there's an instinct toward that on the right, and there has been for a long time. I mean, one of the little vignettes in the book is when Agnew was really up against the ropes and Nixon was really trying to force him to resign because he was trying to basically split he didn't want the impeachment machinery to start up for Agnew because then he thought it would hit him. And so he's trying to get Agnew to resign, basically to head off both the potential prosecution and the potential impeachment. And everybody's advising Agnew to do that, and he's sort of thinking about it, but then he has this kind of Trumpian moment, and he goes, no, I've still got my base. They'll believe whatever I tell them. And he goes out to this Republican Women's Convention in California, and it's this great moment where he says, I will not resign if indicted. And then he just says it again right away. I will not resign if indicted. And the crowd goes crazy. Fight, Spiro, fight. Fight, Spiro, fight. Like, you're my hero, this whole thing. And the reporters who were covering that moment in LA in 1973 said that the thing that they weren't prepared for as reporters was all the Republican women in that audience turning on them and screaming at them and telling them that they weren't using the phrase enemy of the people, but basically telling them that. And there's one, I think it was the LA Times, one outlet noted that some of the women in the audience brought their own tape recorders so they could record Agnew's message, so they could circulate it themselves because they knew the media would take it out of context and do it wrong. Like, there is something that always dovetails between that authoritarian, corrupt, screw the elites, populism, and the often anti-Semitic, anti-elite media thing that is. It's a permanent thing. It's just I think they've just figured out a way to monetize it right now in a way that just means that we've got all of these nascent networks as well as the impulse on their side to look for that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a vice, right? It's a vice. We all have it, right? We all have it. This desire to read only things we agree with, to not challenge ourselves, to not question ourselves. But it's remarkable what happens when that vice is embraced. It turns out, we talk about the supply problem, right? But it turns out there are millions and millions and millions of people who really just want to feel good about what they already thought when they woke up in the morning. I mean, we all have that to some degree. But when you build a political movement around it, that the answers are simple, the enemies are obvious, the enemies are the source of our problems, and you have leaders that accept that, encourage it, embrace or ignore it, and try to reap the whirlwind. You end up in where we're at now. Like, it's funny, Richardson, the Attorney General in Bagman. He has incredible integrity. I teared up when I listened to it the first time because it was like, here's somebody standing up for it with integrity. And, you see a parallel now when you have, some low-level Republican official giving a speech about integrity to certify the vote. And it's, what do you do when it requires courage in a system to just be honest? When the incentives are aligned, so that being fair, being impartial, doing your job requires personal risk.
Yeah. Well, I think the nature of the job has to change, right? If you take the personal risk, you do the courageous thing for the right reasons and stand up and say why you're doing it and say, let the chips fall where they may, and you get rewarded for that, that means that you are in a job and you are perhaps part of a movement that is going to be reality-based and that is going to reward integrity and that is going to be meritocratic in that way. If you are in the kind of job where you stand up and you do all those things and you get destroyed because of it and you're unemployable and you're seen as a disgrace, then you are part of a movement that is not meritocratic, that is advancing its aims and has as its core values something other than integrity, fact-based advancement, and rational argument. I mean, this is why scholars of fascism are well employed right now, right? Like, if it's not about competing to win the argument with the opposition. And if you have the better argument, then you get power and then you use it to implement those ideas that allowed you to win the argument. If you're not doing that, if instead you are trying to rid the world of your opponent and anything is worthy of that, any tactics are worthy of that aim because your opponent needs to be eradicated because they're evil, because they're, child-eating Satanists or whatever. That's a different kind of thing. It's not politics. It's a power movement rather than a governing movement. And I mean, Jon, I think it'll be really interesting to see if Trumpism does succeed in kind of hurting Fox News. It's interesting when Trump gave his 46-minute weird press conference from the White House, he did that on Facebook, right? And they're doing all of this anti-election stuff on One America and Newsmax and these even more obscure things. Mike Flynn's first interview after his pardon was with, I can't even name it, one of these crazy QAnon things.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, Trump every day, Fox News sucks, don't watch Fox, don't watch it. And Fox has taken the hit since the election because of that, both because Trump voters are demoralized, but because he's telling them not to do it. If the Republican Party no longer has a big vehicle like Fox News, telling them what their message is every day, telling them what their values are, telling them who's the hero and who's the goat, the splintering potential within the Republican Party between Trumpism and other types of republicanism and all that stuff, I think is very, very unpredictable because they have had messaging that held them together more than anything with a very big, powerful media entity that is now sucking wind. If it doesn't come back, I think we're going to see how much republicanism and the individual careers of people trying to decide whether to do the right thing depended on how Fox treated them. When that's gone, I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, right? What we are now seeing is, look, Fox has been one of the most pernicious forces in our politics, but inside of Fox, there were people that were actually mitigating some of these incredibly, these what were fringe right-wing fascistic voices. And, talk about supply and demand. The viewers have searched for something that is telling them what they want, right? Newsmax is doing gangbusters numbers on the coup beat. Whereas Fox News has struggled. One last question on this. You talked about being inside of politics versus being outside of politics, which is how I've been thinking about it too. Do you think the less opinionated journalists at places like NBC News, at the Washington Post, do you think they understand that this distinction between when they're inside of politics, when they're outside of politics, when they're covering participants in a debate, and when they're actually defenders of a system just by existing, just by trying to kind of tell an honest story?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like we have gotten more sophisticated so that I'm not hearing a lot of the same sort of dumb question that I had been fending off for my entire adult life, which is whatever happened to objective news, where the person giving you the news had no point of view at all, and it was just straight facts. And now we don't have that anymore. Really? Yes, definitely nobody had an opinion. Walter Cronkite definitely wasn't coming from anywhere, right? This idea of this false voice of God objectivity, which was never true. I mean, just if you were a gay person who lived in any part of the 80s or 90s and was contending with the AIDS crisis and dealing with the mainstream media around that, you tell me that the mainstream media was just the facts and voice of God and not at all taking one side or another in a crisis. It's always driven me crazy, that sort of facile reductive idea about transition in media. I feel like we've gotten more sophisticated about that people do sort of realize now that whoever's speaking, they're always coming from somewhere. And you are better off, for transparency's sake, knowing where they're coming from than pretending like they're above it all and have no personal experience that colors what they do. That said, I think different media organizations have different missions. And the most important thing for me, the most important litmus test as to what sort of a news organization you are, is if you correct things when you get them wrong. If you are found to have said something factually incorrect, not if you had an opinion that didn't pan out the way you said it was going to, but literally if you said something that wasn't true, and you found out that it's not true, are you expected to correct it? Are there standards? Is there an editor? Is there that to me is becoming sort of the difference, the important difference between different types of media outlets. more than this facile idea that, you know, some are independent and some are biased.
Rachel, last question. What are you streaming right now? At the end of the day, what's your pleasure viewing, garbage viewing, guilty pleasure, if you will?
Okay, is Susan awake or asleep?
I'd like both. I'd like to hear
Okay.
both. Actually, that's actually that's a great distinction.
It's important because A, she has COVID fatigue, and so she's falling asleep. And B, I don't like to, I don't, if we're watching something together, as soon as she's fallen asleep, I always turn it off and then I'm going to watch something else. So the thing I'm watching if Susan is asleep is called Cobra, which is a not very good British like situation room drama about there being a solar storm that knocks out the power in England, and the prime minister makes terrible decisions, but he's doing his best, but he's a little hot-tempered. Like solar storm,
Okay.
I'm there. When Susan is awake, if it's a bad day, we're watching The Great British Baking Show, and I make no apologies for it whatsoever.
Nor should you.
It's the best produced television in the history of television. And if it's a good day, we're probably watching The Crown.
You through season 4? Are we in season 4?
We're taking it slow. We're trying to make it last. Yeah.
Okay.
I like, it's too good. Like you can't like.
It's too good. It's too good.
Like literally, if the dog barks, I go back 15 seconds. Something might have happened while he was barking.
And yet, something in this show where nothing happens might have happened. Look, I don't care. I've always despised caring about monarchy as a good American, but I will say that I did Google, did Charles fall off a horse? You know, I just want to know. Rachel Maddow, thank you so much. The book is Bagman. The podcast was absolutely incredible. I can't wait to read the book. It's a fascinating, incredibly relevant story. Everybody check it out. Thanks so much for being here.
Jon, thanks. It's great to see you, my friend. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.